This video is brought to you by Skillshare. Alright, let's do something deeply unpopular. Let's say bad things about an RGG game. Now, I'm not at all unaware of the affection that people have for games from this studio, obviously the Yakuza series, but Judgement as well. It was a very well-received game critically, and for fans of RGG games, they really loved what Judgement was doing. Furthermore, the Judgement franchise has become increasingly important to RGG fans, since this is the franchise that will carry forward the real-time action combat formula that the Yakuza franchise was built on, whereas future Yakuza games will be turn-based going forward, something that many people, including RGG fans, just can't gel with. My connection to games from this studio is not a strong one. I've played a few hours of Yakuza 0, I enjoyed those hours. I played about 20 hours of Yakuza 6 Song of Life. I really enjoyed that. I didn't love the combat, but I totally gelled with the characters, the story, with Kiryu. I don't remember why I stopped playing, but it wasn't because I wasn't enjoying myself. I guess I just got busy with other stuff. I played about 10 hours of Yakuza Like a Dragon, and I absolutely loved that. I loved Ichiban, his buddies, and the exploits they'd all get up to, and I loved the turn-based combat. It felt like such a fresh take on that formula, since it still felt kind of real-time in a way. It really preserved a lot of what underpinned Yakuza's real-time combat, but tightened it up, which really worked for me since I always found Yakuza's combat quite messy. When it comes to the first Judgement game, I very excitedly picked that one up on day one because it just seemed to tick all my boxes. I love detective shit, I always have, and I'm still waiting for the perfect detective game. That doesn't exist yet, Batman doesn't count. I looked at the marketing for Judgement and I got the vibe that this was going to be a more serious take on Kamurocho and what goes down there. Serious things happen in Yakuza games, for sure, but they're also very goofy, and as I looked at Judgement, it definitely gave me the impression that it was going to be a more confronting take, and I was really interested to see where that could go. I bounced off Judgement really fast. I probably put no more than like 5 hours into it because no part of it connected with me, not the story or the main character or any of the gameplay elements that set it apart from the Yakuza games. None of it was working for me. But I know these games are really slow to get going, so I said to myself, I probably just didn't give it enough time. I also looked around and saw all of the positive review sentiment and how much the fans loved it and how much praise the story garnered, and I saw all that and I said, okay, this is clearly a very good game that I just didn't spend enough time with. So Lost Judgement rolls around and I'm like, not gonna repeat that mistake, I'm gonna play and finish Lost Judgement. So I did. I finished the main storyline, a bunch of the side cases, I sampled a range of side activities, I probably spent around 35 to 40 hours with it. It really bums me out to say that I just did not enjoy this, and I think many parts of it are just not good. When I'm reviewing a game, I'm typically asking myself, what are the developers trying to achieve here, and did they do it? After finishing Lost Judgement, I'm very confused about what this game is trying to achieve, but whatever that was, I'm certain the developers did not achieve it. If it is trying to create a detective fantasy where I'm a hard-boiled super sleuth, then none of its gameplay systems, not one, allow me to live out that fantasy because none of them ask me to deduce anything. If it's trying to create a confronting story based on the serious long-term impacts that high school bullying can have, then all of the emotional weight of that story is suffocated by the ridiculous, goofy scenarios on which key plot moments are built. The game is trying to propel you through this breathless page-turning mystery, but all of that sags under this horrible writing that doesn't know how to set up scenes properly, and that labors and explains every single damn point 5 times over. Ironically enough, Judgement is a detective game, but it is also one of the most mindless games I've played in a long time. I never had to use my brain or apply any critical thinking when playing Lost Judgement, not once. The only parts of Lost Judgement that were a success are the stuff that Yakuza games were already doing really well. Principally the comforting bosom of Kamurocho and Yokohama, places where you just want to hang out, cruise around in them. You hit the power button on your PlayStation or your Xbox or whatever, and it doesn't really matter what you're doing, you're just glad to be there. An open world full of interesting side activities to distract you, weird side quests full of creepy perverts who need to be brought to justice, restaurants and cafes and convenience stores all demanding your patronage, and plenty of random people to kick the shit out of just because you feel like it. Everything that Lost Judgement attempts to do to differentiate itself, to stand apart from the Yakuza games, it doesn't succeed. In that way, I don't think this series justifies its own existence. There's so much that you could do with the Yakuza template. This city, this underworld, these characters, their magnificent faces. An independent private eye making his way through all of this, no allegiances to anyone and no loyalties except to the truth, that's a slam dunk premise. Sadly though, at the end of Lost Judgement, I'm just left wishing that I went back and finished Like a Dragon instead. So yeah, this is going to be a very unpopular review. Lost Judgment is the sequel to 2018's Judgement. As in its predecessor, you play as a private detective by the name of Takayuki Yagami, voiced in the Japanese dub by superstar Takuya Kimura. There he is right there, what a handsome devil. You may ask if you need to have played the previous Judgement game to play this one, and I would say it would help, but it's definitely not required. There's plenty of returning characters here, both your buddies and also people you meet on the streets of Kamurocho or Yokohama, so your appreciation of these characters and their backstories will no doubt be enhanced by playing through the first game. Having said that, I never played through the first game and it never felt like a problem here. This is an entirely new, self-contained story, and if you do encounter familiar faces, then the game takes a beat to give you a flashback or some expository dialogue to get you up to speed. Previous Yakuza games can be quite dizzying when you step into them, with a lot of assumed knowledge about character backstories. Lost Judgment definitely sidesteps this, so it's perfectly fine to jump in here. The other question you might have is about the dub. Specifically, why the hell is Shilup playing the English dub? What's the matter with him? It's a fair question, but there's two answers. Number one, I'm making a YouTube video, and a lot of people listen to these while they're doing other things, so the English dub works better for that. Secondly, the English dub is actually really good. It's just full of great, convincing performances. That sort of bad dub thing that we're all so used to when we play Japanese games, that never happens here. Whoever handled the casting, direction, and recording of the English voice actors did an absolutely superb job, as of course did the voice actors themselves.
Right, where do we leave off?
You gotta be shitting me! Yeah, pretty lame talk.
The game is set in two locations, the familiar Kamurocho, host to more than half a dozen Yakuza stories, and the more recently added Yokohama, a waterside district encompassing low-rise development, a commercial space, Chinatown, and a full-size school. The school is important because it's the pillar on which much of the game is built, both narratively and structurally. Yagami is still working out of Kamurocho when some of his old buddies call him up. They've set up their own detective agency in Yokohama, and they invite him to come and help out on a big case. A school chairman is worried that there's bullying taking place in his school, and the only people who can get to the bottom of that are detectives. I would have thought that would have been a job for teachers, but okay, let's roll with it. When Yagami's there, he quickly gets embroiled in high school life, taking on various jobs through the school's extracurricular clubs and solving the problems of both teachers and students alike. The central narrative through line of Lost Judgment is school bullying. It's actually an important topic in Japan at the moment, and I didn't know this, but I looked it up because I was like, why did the developers choose to do this? And yeah, there is a bullying epidemic in Japanese schools, or at least it's something that educators and politicians are talking about. It's a pretty widely known statistic that there's a very high rate of suicide in Japan, and certainly some of this can be attributed to school bullying. So it's a real topic, and it's an important topic, and Lost Judgment handles the subject with the appropriate deftness and sensitivity, because it essentially implies that the best way to deal with a school bully is for someone to kick the shit out of them, and by someone, I mean a 40-year-old man in tight jeans and a leather jacket. The first moment I arrive in Yokohama, I see school bullies hassling someone in the street, and then me and my buddy, a former Yakuza dude, now my sidekick, we just kick the shit out of them. These are like children, like teenagers by the way, I mean 15, 16 years old, I don't know, maybe a little bit older. I'm a 40-year-old man in tight jeans and a leather jacket, and I am absolutely dumpstering these kids. When this happened the first time, it was before I got to the school, and I was like, okay, that was weird. Turns out that was just the first of many, many occasions where I would have to beat the shit out of children. There are many checkpoints in this game's opening 10 hours where bullies are just being horrible, and I talk to them, I chew them out for a bit, and they tell me to go fuck myself, and then I'm like, alright, time to go to Pound Town. Now I get that this is the campy Yakuza style of storytelling with unashamed transitions into showdowns faster than a Mortal Kombat cutscene. I get it, and I've always been on board with it, and I'm on board with it for the rest of the game. But it's weird that I'm a 40-year-old man in tight jeans and a leather jacket, and I'm kicking the shit out of kids. That felt like, okay, I'm not sure that this scene has been set up correctly. Because there would have been some way to make this work, but what you honestly have are these harrowing scenes of school bullying and harassment, and you have these really serious, protracted exchanges about why bullying is so bad, and you have teachers in tears worrying about the damage that bullying is doing to their students, and then there's you, just beating up kids. This is what I mentioned at the start of my review about the goofy premises on which key plot points are built and how they just undermine everything. You can't have it both ways. You can't have this serious emotional drama that is trying to impart a message about bullying and also beat up school kids. For real, there is one section at this school where I go around disguised as a maintenance man, and I put up cameras everywhere to spy on kids. I even put one in the bathroom. I go full Dr. Disrespect. Later on, one of the cameras is discovered by a student and she's like, "You're a pervert." And I'm like, yes, that is a reasonable conclusion to reach when you see a man walking around a school installing hidden cameras. So what do? I grab the camera and I jump out the window. The term ludonarrative dissonance does not do justice to whatever it is that's happening in this opening section of the game, and it totally took me out of the experience. When all this was happening, I was like, okay, I get it now. Judgement wants to be taken seriously by connecting to a bunch of themes and issues and events that are serious and confronting, but it never actually wants to properly interface with those things. It just wants to use them as window dressing to set up the next fight scene. The bullying throughline is a good example of this. Yeah, you see bullying take place in schools, but it's a very overt kind of 2D rendition of it, like snarling bullies and unrestrained violence. That stuff definitely still happens in real life, but modern day bullying is just as much about cyberbullying and the feeling that people have of no escape, not outside the school grounds, not at home, and certainly not in social media spaces. At no point in the entire game do you ever actually speak to anyone who has been bullied and explore their perspective and what they're going through. Similarly, a lot of the plot is built around the price that bullies should end up paying, but at no point does it explore the idea that bullies are also kids, and that they can change as they get older, and their sins in their high school years shouldn't necessarily define their entire lives. I think about something like Persona 5, also set in a high school. There's a game that actually said some stuff. There's a game that was actually confronting. Persona did not hold back on the subjects it engaged, and parts of it made you think, and it made you feel uncomfortable in a way that Lost Judgement absolutely never comes close to. If it feels like I'm talking too much about this stuff, then don't play Lost Judgement, because it's essentially 35 to 40 hours of talking about this stuff. And with so little to actually say or educate on the subject, that conversation really drags. I don't want to give the impression that the entire saga plays out in a schoolyard though. This is essentially the first act, and it's the first 10 or so hours that sets up the rest of the story, which does eventually spill out onto the streets of Yokohama and even back to Kamurocho. It spirals wider and wider, pulling in former Yakuza, a new upstart gang called RK, various independent forces of the city, all who have their own agenda, and of course, local law enforcement who certainly aren't there to protect and serve. The next two acts are much better because they play out in a space that a detective belongs, the seedy underworld of Japan, not a playground. Things do get better, but not by much, and most of that has to do with just how bad a lot of the writing is.
There's clearly more to Ehara than an officer turned groper. More than likely, he's an accomplice to murder.
You should have had the sense to leave long before now.
Believe me, once I learn what I need about Mikoshiba-kun, I'm gone.
The reviews for Lost Judgement aren't out yet because I'm doing this review on the embargo, but when they do hit, I expect you'll hear a lot of praise for Lost Judgement's story. I think there's some truth to that, but I think story is a pretty broad term that encompasses things like plot, pacing, and dialogue. It's very rare that I would unpack that word in that way, but I think it's really important in the case of Lost Judgement. I actually think Lost Judgement has a pretty cool plot. It's very convoluted and very full of contrivances, but it definitely has plenty of interesting events and connections, and you'll certainly find yourself intrigued by parts of it. It doesn't happen often enough, but sometimes the game will reveal something to you, and you're like, oh shit, here we go. Those crucial page-turning reveals that are the bread and butter of good crime fiction. Like I said, the game doesn't have a lot of them, but it does have them, and when they hit, they do hit hard. There's a lot in this plot. It starts very small and very localized, and in the end it gets very big, but it doesn't ever lose the plot, so to speak. It does keep things connected to the people and events that started it all, so that when everything is resolved, it does feel pretty satisfying. I won't spoil any of it, of course, but if I was to just put all of this on a whiteboard and you could experience the plot in a few minutes, I'm pretty sure you'd be like, yeah, cool, that's clever, nice plot. The problem is that it doesn't take a few minutes to get through this plot. It takes between 30 and 40 hours, and very, very often, this game just feels so drawn out. It feels weird to talk about pacing in an RGG game since the whole point of the game is to sample the city and the side quests and the side activities. A brisk pace is not the point. However, even in this context, Lost Judgement feels so badly paced because it just takes so long to do or say anything. I think the critical failure of Lost Judgement is that it does not know how to set up or deliver a scene. Every scene is stuffed with painful, drawn out dialogue that doesn't advance the story. Every reveal is explained in nauseating detail and then re-explained to you just in case anyone might have missed it. Every subsequent scene feels the need to re-examine and re-explain what you've already discovered or already been told. For example, there's a piece of evidence that I discover and it's a pretty big deal. After I discover this evidence, I present it to no less than 6 people, and each time I explain in great detail what that evidence is and what it means. I already know what this evidence is, but I'm explaining it to another character in the story. 6 times. There's a court case scene at one point in this game that goes for like 20 minutes, and 18 of those minutes are explaining things that have already been discovered and explained and re-explained multiple times. The point of a scene in any medium, TV show, movie, book, a play, whatever, the point of a scene is not to educate the characters in that story. The point of a scene is to educate and entertain the audience. If your audience already knows something, figure out a way to impart that information to other characters that doesn't waste the audience's time. This game does not grasp that concept, and I just got so fed up with having every major plot point and reveal retrodden so that some new throwaway character I just met could be brought up to speed. Similarly, the writing does not know how to do a reveal that doesn't culminate in a confessional monologue. Every major reveal is a big question mark until someone admits it, and luckily, they're always willing to oblige. Most of the villains in this story would be just fine and dandy if they just kept their mouths shut, but through some contrivance they always end up spilling their guts. In this way, most of the reveals end up feeling like the end of a Scooby-Doo episode, where the villain is unmasked and then proceeds to explain their villainous intent to the gang and to the nearby authorities taking copious notes. A good detective story is full of a lot of empty space, and those spaces exist so that audiences can fill them up with their own theories. The writer has to leave so much unanswered and so much unsaid so the audience can think on that stuff and then analyze it so that they feel like they're the detective. At no point in all of Lost Judgment was I able to occupy that headspace. There is nothing left unsaid in this dialogue. Nothing at all. This ultimately gives Lost Judgment the feeling of being kind of like young adult fiction. Like, this is not pitched at an adult reading level, and I was bummed about that because I really thought that that's what it would be given the way the game presents itself, and you can tell the game really is trying to be that. It's trying to be adult, but it simply isn't. So you've already clicked dislike on this video, there's no point in me holding back now, I'm just gonna say it. Yagami is just the worst, most boring protagonist I've hung out with since Ethan Winters in Resident Evil. Yagami has no personality. He never cracks any jokes, he doesn't have any interesting turns of phrase in his arsenal, he has no fatal flaws, no vices. Yagami has 2 conversation modes: asking questions so that he can then repeat the answers back 2 or 3 times, and moralizing, where he just lectures bad guys, good guys, you the player, any and everyone that will listen. He will lecture ad nauseum about how truth is good, and bending the rules is bad, and justice must prevail, and blah 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 blah. I actually took down in my notes, there will be no Yagami memes. Because for a character to have memes made about them, they need to either do interesting things, or say interesting things, or have a personality. And he doesn't do any of those things. Sure enough, I googled Yagami memes. What did I get? Death Note memes. I googled Takayuki Yagami memes, and what did I get? Basically nothing. Contrast that with pages and pages of Ichiban memes, Kiryu memes. Hell, don't even bother googling for Geralt or Shepard or Nathan Drake or Solid Snake or any of these great characters. Just don't. It's a shame because this game has a really great cast and every single one of them would be more interesting as a protagonist than Yagami. The old fat man who runs the law office would be a more interesting leading man than Yagami. There's talk that this dude might be replaced in the future because of contract and agency bullshit, and no disrespect to the actor who plays him, because he did the best he could with the material in front of him. It's not about the actor, it's about the character Yagami. He sucks. He's just this massive black hole at the center of the screen, and moving on from him would be a very, very good choice.
Suspicious.
The Judgement franchise exists as something connected to, but separate from, the Yakuza franchise. And certainly one of the things that's intended to help it carve out its own unique identity is its detective gameplay. But just as the narrative does not give you the space to become the detective, the gameplay systems do not either. There's no shortage of these systems, mind you. There's observing crime scenes to spot details, there's stealth, there's tailing missions, there's city chases, there's interrogations, there's all sorts of gadgets you can pull out at any time, there's a traversal thing that you have to use to break into buildings. All of this stuff exists, it's just really mindless, AAA, push forward to win kind of stuff. For example, examining a crime scene. Yes, you have to do it. but all it is just wiping your cursor over the environment until something pings. You don't have to think or apply your brain, you just move the cursor. It's not even particularly intuitive, since most of the stuff that gets highlighted doesn't even have any reason to be remarked upon. It's just stuff that's there to give you more things to click on. Same goes for the traversal stuff. This is not only really buggy, but it's also just mindless. You just push up and across for a minute or two and then it's over. There were 2 tailing missions I had to do in the entire main storyline, which I understand is probably welcome news, since I know reviews complained about the fact that there were too many of these in the first game, but these are just sort of like walking slowly behind someone while they walk. The stealth probably is the worst and most frustrating gameplay system. This is entirely on rails. There's only one path you can take, and guards can't see you even when you're in plain sight, and the only way to take them down is to throw a coin to distract them so you can get behind them and KO them. If you get behind them without distracting them with a coin, no, back to the checkpoint for you. You have to throw that coin first. Ridiculous. The interrogations or just straight dialogue sequences are so emblematic of what this game is. There's no failure state in these exchanges. You can just hit whatever option appears, and in the end it will guide you towards the right conclusion. It's essentially this. It's the Fallout 4 approach to dialogue trees, and again, it just means that you don't ever have to think. This is most typified by the case file that you maintain in your menu. Every time you gain a new clue, a little prompt will appear being like, hey, your case file just got updated with new important evidence. And at first I was like, oh cool, I'm gonna have to pore through this at some point and try and find some clue I might have missed. But no, I never once had to open that case file. The game is meticulously recording evidence, events, statements. All of it is in this case file, but you never once need to open it because the game never asks you to think. It never once asks you to be a detective. Lost Judgement does not ask me to seriously consider its themes because it doesn't fully commit to those themes. It doesn't ask me to read between the lines of dialogue because there's no space between those lines. It doesn't challenge me to find evidence because the gameplay systems don't allow for it, and it doesn't ask me to critically analyze and synthesize evidence because all of the conclusions are spoon-fed to me. Lost Judgement never asks me to do any of those things, but what it does ask me to do, pretty often in fact, is punch stuff. I feel like a lot has been written about Yakuza's combat in the past, and I don't think I'm going to be able to add much in the way of insight here. It's really a case of you either like it or you don't. Those that do enjoy it will tell you that it's a modern take on the classic 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up brawlers like Double Dragon, where you can pick up a traffic cone and beat someone to death with it, because why not? It's about cathartic release, spectacle, mayhem. A street brawl isn't about watertight combat mechanics and clear telegraphs and varied enemy design. It's typically just dudes throwing hands until someone hits the pavement. Old Yakuza combat and current Judgement combat are probably the most accurate representations of street fights we have in video games, even though they are full of like EX power-ups and heat moves and all that jazz. Those that don't enjoy it will say that it's a pretty messy and repetitive affair. Staying focused on a single target is not easy. Controlling the camera is not good. Enemies will snap into a block unexpectedly. Their movement speed is wildly inconsistent. Most enemies you face have almost no health, whereas boss enemies have too much health. Despite unlocking new abilities and combos, combat doesn't materially change from the start of the game to the end of the game. It always feels largely similar. Not to fence sit, but I actually think both of these perspectives are absolutely correct. Yakuza's combat is sometimes awesome, sometimes terrible, and mostly fine. When it's at its best, you're absolutely encircled by floral shirt-wearing dudes. Each of their health pools buffed just enough to make them meaty, but not so buff that they become fist sponges. You see a dude with a weapon coming towards you and you switch into your green serpent stance, since that's the one that lets you disarm dudes, and then you switch into your red tiger stance, since that's the one that lets you lay down the biggest damage on a single target. When a group of reinforcements arrive, you switch to your blue crane stance, since that's the one that turns you into a human blender, absolutely mincing any fool stupid enough to be within striking distance of your white sneakers. Over time, your arsenal of moves grow and they allow for more expression, but yeah, the game never really asks any more of you. There's no new enemy type that shows up demanding a different playstyle. Things don't become materially more challenging. It's literally just a case of you have more options with which to smack someone down. This is fairly counterintuitive in the world of video games. We typically expect combat challenge to increase as our power increases, but Judgement doesn't do that. For that reason, Judgement is going to work for those who appreciate the freedom of expression that it provides, but it will probably bore those who want combat to be a sort of puzzle that needs to be solved. The only way the game does become more difficult is through mini-boss and boss enemies, who each have a specific charge attack that they use, sort of like their version of a heat move. These moves will essentially two-shot you if they land, and they're very frustrating because they don't have proper telegraphs and they can reach you from pretty much anywhere, and the parry window for them is really small. I enjoyed Lost Judgment's combat, but I absolutely hated this difficulty crutch, and these were the only things that would send me back to the "you died" screen. Any combat system that is so leveraged into these single cheap two-shot moves obviously has some problems. But yeah, overall combat is fun. I don't think it's a reason to want to play a game like this. This is an open world, narratively led RPG action game. Do you play The Witcher for the combat? Probably not. The combat in The Witcher is fine, but you probably play it for a bunch of other stuff. I think it's the same here in Lost Judgement for most people. Though, of course, some people absolutely love the combat and swear by it, and other people think it's trash. One thing that everyone agrees on is that hanging out in Kamurocho and Yokohama is really fun, and that absolutely has not changed here in Lost Judgement. If you just beeline your way through Lost Judgement, or any RPG game really, you're absolutely playing it wrong. Around you are these slices of vibrant cityscape, each of them brimming with weirdos and heroes and passers-by and dive bars and arcades and batting cages and so much more. If you just ignore all of that, then you definitely haven't experienced what this game is offering. Don't think that side content is just throwaway, do it once and forget 'em kind of activities either. A lot of these activities have really robust progression systems attached to them. A simple game of darts could just be a simple game of darts, but there are actually different modes and different difficulties to choose from, and hidden throughout the city are better darts that you can purchase that will improve your performance in this minigame. You're incentivized to earn money, explore all of the retailers, and find those darts so you can go back and get a higher score. Same thing goes for the batting cages and golf driving ranges and, the drone racing. Your drone is just a shitty drone at the start, but you collect materials throughout the city and then you build upgrades and apply them, so by the end of it, your drone is like this superpowered monster. There's this VR minigame. Holy shit, I don't even know how to explain what this is. It's like some weird virtual reality board game with combat and drone racing and weird little treasure goblin thing that pops up and gives you bonus loot. It's utter madness, right? You're literally just walking down the street and then this guy's like, hey, want to check out my weird VR thing? And you're like, okay. And then you discover all of this. And that's what Kamurocho and Yokohama are. These really beautiful, dense, lived-in spaces full of so much weird shit to discover. 35 or 40 hours deep, I've only scratched the surface of what these spaces have to offer, and completionists will spend around about 100 hours knocking all of this over should they choose to. So while I may not recommend Lost Judgement, I absolutely recommend Kamurocho and Yokohama. But that's the kicker, right? And that comes back to the point I made at the start of this video. We've already had those spaces, courtesy of the Yakuza games. So what does Lost Judgement add to justify itself? It's not its confronting themes, it's simply too goofy to say anything meaningful about its source material. It's not its storyline or its plot, they're too clumsy and drawn out to justify the time invested. It's not its gameplay systems. Every detective-based system it uses to try to differentiate itself comprehensively fails to deliver the detective fantasy, nor do any of them ask you to engage your brain in any way. And it's certainly not Yagami, barely a cardboard cutout when set against this impressive supporting cast of heroes and villains. Lost Judgement feels like a really long, awkward DLC for a Yakuza game, introducing new things for new things' sake without ever having a clear vision for what it wants to say or do to set itself apart from its source material. In short, Lost Judgement is just lost. Before we go, this video was brought to you by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes for creative and curious people on topics including illustration, design, photography, video, freelancing, and more. On Skillshare, millions of members come together to find inspiration and take the next step in their creative journey. So here's the thing about Skillshare, right? You can absolutely just go online and start watching YouTube videos about any of these subjects, but you have to wade through so much stuff to find the right content, the right teachers, and if you do manage to find it, you're still doing doing all of this learning on your own. There's no support, no community. That's where Skillshare is different. Skillshare's courses are put together by experts in their field, like this guy, who's an award-winning photographer and videographer and a successful YouTube creator. He's distilled a decade's worth of knowledge into a brief, entry-level course that will teach you how to take professional-looking photos using only an iPhone. There's a complete lesson plan, a discussion board, and a space for other students of the course to post and discuss their work. So they're not just doing this on their own, they're connecting with other people who share the same interest or passion. That's what Skillshare ultimately is. It's a place to not only learn, but to connect with experts and other people who also want to learn. If you're serious about gaining a new skill, either as a hobby or for your profession, or simply because it interests you, I really recommend clicking on the link in the description below. And as an added bonus, the first 1,000 people who click the link will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium. Thanks Skillshare for sponsoring the video, and thank you for watching it. Thanks for watching my video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down so I know to do better for next time. If you enjoyed yourself, consider subscribing, and if you really enjoyed yourself, maybe consider hitting that notification bell so you never miss a video. You can see my patrons here on the left. They're awesome. They're amazing. If you want to join them, check out my Patreon page. Thank you again. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.